All of you in your 20s and 30s, what bands do you consider as classic rock? By the way, I'm 53. I am just curious how my classic rock compares to your classic rock. I feel like classic rock is more of a genre in its own right than just music from 30 years ago. Like some radio DJs think it is. It will always be the Rolling Stones and their ilk. Green Day's Dookie might be 29 years old now, but it's not classic rock. My niece took a class on protest music in college and she referred to Rage Against the Machine as classic rock. That cut me deeply as a man born in the early 80s. Classic rock is not just old music from 40 years ago. Classic rock represents an era of music between the 1960s–1990s which was a golden era for rock music. The Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Rush, The Who, The Rolling Stones, etc. Pearl Jam's music is great, and it's from about 30 years ago. But it isn't classic rock. I'm 40, so I'm not the target group OP is looking for. But I have my thoughts on this question. For me, classic rock is any rock music produced and released before 1980. Music from the 80s and after is categorized as just that. 80s insert genre here, 90s insert genre here, insert genre here. Classic rock is like Led Zeppelin and AC/DC, not Green Day. Rolling Stones, Beatles, Foreigner, AC/DC, Metallica, Aerosmith, Styx, Van Halen. I think you get where I'm at. 29 Yo here. My dad made sure to foster a great taste in music. Classic rock for me is 60s, 70s, some 80s. Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Doors, etc., etc. I say some 80s because personally I would classify some of those bands as classic rock like GNR, Def Leppard, Motley Crue. 60s and 70s, mainly because I love that era of rock and don't really like the 80s era. 60s, 70s. Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, etc. Eagles, Beatles, Stones, Blue Oyster, Zeppelin, Fleetwood. Basically rock that came out early 60s to late 70s, early 80s. Led Zepp, Stones, The Who, The Doors, Tom Petty. I'm 30 and consider all rock that is pre-grunge as classic rock. That's just me though. Younger people definitely consider bands like Pearl Jam, Nirvana, early Radiohead, etc. as classic rock. This is gonna hurt. I'm 38, and our local commercial classic rock station started playing 90s alternative and grunge music. So there's that. Personally, I think it's a pointless distinction since classic isn't a particular style but a descriptor of something that stands out as a definitive example of a particular category or style. Smashing Pumpkins' Zero is as much a classic now of 90s rock music as Radar Love is a classic example of 70s rock. Late 60s, early 80s. In part because that's the kind of shit they played on classic rock radio stations when I was a kid. But also I think that the 80s with MTV and the synthesizer in particular killed classic rock as a monolithic blanket genre. Of course there are all sorts of subgenres within the 60s and 70s. So it's kinda hard to chalk any of it up to being classic rock. I think AC/DC, Led Zeppelin and Van Halen. Basically all the bands that are on Walmart t-shirts that I've heard their name but never actually heard their music. Anything pre-2000 generally. Usually it's 1960s, 1980s minus most hair metal. And even then, there's different areas of classic rock. The Beatles, The Grateful Dead, Kiss, Black Sabbath, and Pink Floyd are also classic rock. But they're all very different sounding bands. For me it's anything between the Beatles and Metallica. I have yet to concede that the grunge era is classic rock. but by strict standard it is rock made prior to 1990. Person shrugging. 1965-1980. Anything that sounds like it was made in the 80s. I think it's more about the sound and less about the period. So in that regard we should all probably have the same idea of classic rock in our heads. I'd consider AC/DC's Black Ice or Airborne's Runnin' Wild as classic rock even though they were released in the late 2000s. But still consider Marilyn Manson's Antichrist Superstar or Korn's Follow the Leader more modern, even though they were made in the late 90s. AC/DC. Classic rock. One of my favorite genres as someone in my mid-30s. My definition of classic rock might be a bit different from yours. For me, classic rock includes bands like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, AC/DC, Aerosmith, and Queen. But hey, everyone's taste in music is subjective. So there's no right or wrong answer here. What are some of your favorite classic rock bands? U2, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins, ECT. Pink Floyd. Anything before we knew boomers were the boomers of today, lacking empathy and understanding. Any rock band of singer from Elvis until Queen. AC/DC. Lady Gaga's The Fame. Aside from the obvious answer of rock bands from the 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s, I would say bands from the grunge rock era. Pearl Jam, Green Day, Nirvana, Metallica, etc. Blink-182. Blink-182. Me Too. This should be good. 80s. What about the 40-year-olds? AC/DC and Rolling Stones will forever be my go-to classic rock bands. I guess anything from the 60s to 80s is considered classic rock. I think Chuck Berry is classic rock since 50s and 60s rock is what I think as classic rock. Modern rock for me is like the cult and whatnot 80s bands. New rock is like MGMT. Thin Lizzy, U2, Queen, AC/DC, etc. 60s to 80s, but I stick to the technical definition to annoy my GF and make her feel old by calling Marilyn Manson classic rock. All of them. I see classic rock as what it was when I was a kid: Zeppelin, Skynyrd, etc. I'm 40 and get upset when bands from the 90s, early are called classic. Anything before 1975 but not AC/DC. Just don't do this to me. I am not old, it's you. You're all old. 80s rock is what I consider classic rock. I am 30 years old. I'm 33, born in 1990. I guess classic rock would have to come before me in 1990. I don't know really, lol. I am 27, and I put Tom Petty and similar bands in my classic rock playlist. I'm not sure. I don't really listen to classic rock. 28M. I consider any music made from 1960-1979 classic rock. 30 here. I generally go with 60s-80s rock with preference given to 80s, 60s and 70s feels more like prequel rock than the main event. That being said, if pressed, I'd also give 90s alternative a pass, albeit grudgingly. Basically, I consider classic rock as anything that came out before I was born. I think of classic rock as any rock after 1960 and before 90s grunge. I'm in my 30s. It's the Eagles, Queen, the Beatles, CCR, anything from the 60s, 80s. Smash Mouth. I think the more painful question is what you whippersnappers consider oldies these days. I am prepared to feel old.